He dug a hole in the heart of Cairo and sworn that even the Lord's own light would not find it. Down there he fed men to the silence and called himself safe. But Al-Basir was watching the dark long before the dark began to watch him. In the suffocating grip of the year 1340, the sprawling metropolis of Cairo was a city of two faces, a shimmering mirage of piety and pestilence where the call of the muezzin battled against the cacophony of the damned. It was a place where gold dust settled in the cracks of mud bricks and where the stench of the tanning vats mingled with the heady aroma of frankincense, creating a perfume that was as intoxicating as it was nauseating. At the heart of this sweltering labyrinth sat the palace of Emir Qasim, a structure so magnificent that commoners would avert their gaze for fear of being blinded by its whitewashed walls and turquoise tiles. To the observer standing in the dusty street, Qasim was the epitome of Mamluk grace, a man who moved with the silent lethargy of a predator and whose robes of damask silk were never stained by the grit of the city. He was a creature of obsessive cleanliness and terrifying vanity, a man who would have a servant beaten within an inch of his life for a smudge of soot on a silver goblet. But this obsession with purity was merely a distraction, a gilded curtain drawn tight to hide a soul that had long since begun to rot from the inside out. While the sun beat down upon the minarets and the faithful prostrated themselves in the courtyards of the mosques, Qasim was occupied with a project that defied the laws of heaven. Deep beneath the marble floors of his reception hall, far below the reach of the sunlight and the rhythmic flow of the Nile, he had commissioned the construction of a void. This was not merely a cellar or a dungeon for storing grain or wine, but a temple dedicated to the absence of light. Scores of mute laborers were brought in under the cover of the moonless nights to dig into the bedrock, their chisels wrapped in thick cloth to dampen the sound of metal striking stone. They hollowed out the earth with frantic desperation, creating a vertical shaft that plunged into the cold, damp belly of the world. Qasim oversaw the work with the feverish intensity of a mad architect, demanding that the walls be lined with black basalt, a stone so dark and dense that it seemed to drink the very flame of the torches. He designed the chamber to be a place where sound went to die, a hermetically sealed box of silence where a man could scream until his throat tore and not a whisper would reach the surface. The Emir's motivation was born of a singular, blasphemous arrogance that festered in his heart like a gangrenous wound. He had convinced himself that the jurisdiction of the divine, the all-encompassing gaze of the Creator, was bound by the properties of the physical world. In his twisted logic, he believed that if he could create a space of absolute, impenetrable darkness, a place where not even a single photon of light existed, he could effectively blind the eye of judgment. He sought to create a pocket of existence outside of creation, a loophole in the fabric of reality where he could indulge his most sadistic urges without consequence. As the final stones were laid and the heavy iron trapdoor was fitted with its complex locking mechanism, Qasim stood at the edge of the abyss, breathing in the cold, stale air that drifted up from the dark. It smelled of wet earth and ancient dust, a scent that excited him more than the finest perfumes of the East. He looked down into the pitch blackness, a darkness so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against his eyes, and he smiled. He believed he had built a fortress against God himself, unaware that he had merely dug a grave for his own soul, and that the darkness he courted was not a shield, but a waiting mouth. The hospitality of Emir Qasim became the stuff of legend throughout the bazaars and caravanserais of the Mamluk Sultanate, whispered about with a reverence that masked a creeping, inexplicable dread. To receive a summons to his table was to be touched by fortune itself, for his feasts were renowned as spectacles of gluttony and refinement where the wine flowed like the spring floods of the Nile and the air hung heavy with the smoke of ambergris and expensive hashish. Yet, it was a curious arithmetic that plagued the merchant guilds of Cairo, for while many entered the great cedar gates of the palace, the number of those who departed seemed always to be one fewer than the count of arrivals. The emir favored a specific breed of guest, men whose bellies were as full as their coin purses, travelers from far-off Aleppo or the spice-rich coasts of Yemen who carried their fortunes in jewels sewn into the lining of their belts. On a particularly moonless night in the autumn of the year 1341, a silk merchant named Ibrahim, whose caravan had just arrived laden with the treasures of the East, found himself the guest of honor in Qasim's private solar. The room was a kaleidoscope of geometric mosaics and hanging lamps of colored glass, casting a warm, hypnotic glow that danced upon the silver platters of roasted squab and pomegranate seeds. Qasim played the host with the serpentine grace of a viper, pouring the sweet, spiced wine with his own manicured hands, his eyes crinkling with a warmth that never quite reached the icy depths of his pupils. He spoke of trade routes and tariffs, lulling the merchant into a stupor of comfort and intoxication, until the room began to swim and the floor seemed to tilt like the deck of a ship in a storm. It was not a sudden violence that befell the guest, but a slow, narcotic descent into oblivion, brought on by a potent tincture of datura and opium dissolved in the dregs of the cup. When the merchant's heavy head finally hit the table, the masquerade of civility evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, mechanical efficiency. Slaves, their tongues removed to ensure their silence, emerged from the shadows like specters to strip the unconscious man of his finery, peeling away the layers of silk and velvet until he was as naked as the day he was born, shivering in the draughty hall. They did not drag him to the street or the river, but to the center of the room where a cleverly concealed mechanism, counterweight with sandbags, opened a black mouth in the floor. Down went the merchant, lowered by ropes into the bowels of the earth, descending past the foundations of the palace into the basalt chamber that Qasim had prepared with such meticulous cruelty. The trapdoor was sealed, the rugs replaced, and the scent of the dinner cleared away, leaving no trace of the crime save for the lingering ghost of a laugh. When Ibrahim awoke, he did not wake to the morning sun or the call to prayer, but to a sensory void so absolute that he clawed at his own face just to confirm he still possessed hands. The darkness was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that pressed against his eardrums, and the silence was louder than any scream. He was trapped in a stone box where time had no meaning, a place where the cardinal directions dissolved into nothingness and the mind, starved of stimulation, began to cannibalize itself. But the true horror of this subterranean purgatory was not the isolation of the victim, but the presence of the observer. Adjacent to the pit, separated by a wall of stone 3 feet thick, ran a narrow, secret corridor that only the emir could access. Embedded in this wall, at the height of a man's eye, was a singular engineering marvel, a ventilation grate angled in such a way that it allowed a sliver of air and sound to pass, but permitted no light to enter the cell. Here, in his own private darkness, Qasim would stand for hours, pressing his face against the cold masonry, listening to the shuffling feet and the rising panic of the man below. He could not see them with his eyes, for the pit was devoid of all light, yet his imagination painted every movement in vivid, sadistic detail. He relished the sound of their weeping, the scratching of fingernails against the unforgiving basalt, the inevitable bargaining with a god they feared had abandoned them. To Qasim, this was the ultimate power, the power of the jinn, to see without being seen, to be the invisible auditor of another soul's torment. He would stand there, clutching the merchant's stolen emeralds in his sweating palm, whispering mocking comforts that the prisoner could never hear. In his twisted mind, he absolved himself of all guilt, he reasoned that he had not struck the man, nor shed his blood, but simply placed him in a room of nothingness. If the man died of terror or thirst, it was the will of the dark, not the hand of Qasim. This voyeurism became his addiction, a drug more potent than the opium he fed his victims, and with every soul he consumed in the silence of the pit, he grew more convinced that he had successfully blinded the heavens, unaware that the eye of Al-Sabur never blinks and that the darkness he worshipped was merely recording his sins for a judgment that would be as inescapable as the grave he had dug for others. The coffers of Emir Qasim began to swell with a grotesque obesity, fed by a tributary of blood and silence that flowed beneath the foundations of his palace like a dark, subterranean river. With every merchant who vanished into the basalt throat of his dungeon, the emir's treasury grew heavy with the spoils of the dead, a king's ransom in stolen dinars, minted silver dirhams from Damascus, and rubies the size of pigeon eggs that had once warmed the bellies of unfortunate travelers. He ceased to be merely a man of wealth and transformed into a titan of avarice, his fortune seemingly conjured from the very air, for there were no ledgers to balance and no trade deals to honor. The goods of the vanished, bolts of Chinese silk, sacks of saffron worth more than their weight in gold, and ivory carved by the hands of Zanzibar masters, were laundered through a network of fences and shadow brokers in the back alleys of the Khan el-Khalili, returning to the emir as clean, consecrated coin. Yet, as his material wealth reached heights that rivaled the Sultan himself, a more terrifying transformation was taking place within the architecture of his mind. The fear of discovery, which had once been a sharp, metallic taste in his mouth, had entirely evaporated, replaced by an intoxicating, delirious arrogance that bordered on divinity. He began to view his crimes not as sins, but as triumphs of intellect, proofs of his superiority over the herd of common men who bound themselves with the chains of morality and fear. In the dead of night, when the city outside lay under the heavy blanket of sleep, Qasim would descend to the viewing slit, not merely to listen to the dying whimpers of his latest guest, but to conduct a blasphemous sermon to the void. He would press his lips close to the cold stone grate and whisper into the suffocating blackness, his voice a sibilant hiss that mocked the very heavens. He spoke to the darkness as if it were a conspirator, a distinct entity that he had tamed and bent to his will. He reasoned, with the twisted logic of a fever dream, that the recording angels, the Kiraman Katibin who sit upon the shoulders of every mortal to inscribe their deeds, were creatures of light, and therefore, their jurisdiction ended where the light failed. In his madness, he believed he had discovered a theological loophole, a blind spot in the omniscience of the Creator. Here, he would murmur, stroking the rough masonry with a lover's tenderness, the ink of the angels runs dry. Here, in the belly of the earth, there is no witnessing eye, no accusing finger, only the silence that I command. He laughed, a low, bubbling sound that echoed in the narrow corridor, convinced that the stone walls were thick enough to deafen the sky, that the layers of earth and rock were a shield that not even the wrath of the divine could penetrate. By day, this monster walked the sun-drenched streets of Cairo with the beatific smile of a saint, a performance of such consummate skill that it bordered on art. He endowed madrasas and commissioned public fountains, his name praised by the very orphans whose fathers were slowly rotting in the labyrinth beneath his feet. He moved through the crowded souks, his entourage parting the sea of unwashed bodies, a vision of pristine purity in robes of white linen that seemed to repel the dust of the city. He would stop to converse with the qadis and the scholars, nodding sagely as they debated the finer points of jurisprudence, all the while hiding the trembling ecstasy of his secret life behind a mask of practiced piety. But there was a ritual to his deception, a compulsive habit that betrayed the rot beneath the veneer. He washed his hands incessantly, scrubbing the skin with rough pumice and dousing himself in excessive amounts of rosewater and heavy musk. To the public, this was merely the fastidiousness of a high-born lord, but to Qasim, it was a necessity, for no matter how much gold he amassed, the phantom scent of rust, the metallic tang of old blood and the sour reek of fear, clung to his nostrils. He believed the scent was on his skin, leaking from his pores, a telltale stain that only he could smell. This duality split his existence into two warring halves, the daylight prince of charity and the midnight king of the pit. As the months turned into years, the line between these two worlds began to blur, and his sense of invincibility hardened into a diamond-like certainty. He would look up at the blazing sun, the eye of the day, and feel not humility, but a sneering contempt. He felt he had outwitted the cosmos, that he had carved out a sovereign territory where the laws of cause and effect did not apply. He walked with a swagger that was almost imperceptible but deeply felt, the gait of a man who believes he cannot fall. He would sit in his garden, listening to the fountain bubble, while 20 feet below him, a man clawed at the walls in total sensory deprivation, and the contrast between the sunlight on his face and the horror beneath his sandals gave him a rush of power more potent than any opium. He had become a god of his own small, dark universe, the master of a hidden hell, utterly convinced that because he could not see the judgment coming, it simply did not exist. He was a man standing on the precipice of a volcano, laughing at the smoke, believing that because he had commanded the fire to sleep, it would never wake to consume him. The night of the reckoning arrived on the wings of a suffocating stillness, a heaviness in the air so profound that the very flames of the torches in the courtyard seemed to gasp for oxygen, flickering low and blue in the stagnant heat. It was the 14th day of the month of Safar, in the year 1342, a date that would be etched into the hidden history of Cairo not in ink, but in the scratches of fingernails against stone. Amir Qasim, restless and consumed by a hunger that the finest roasted meats could not sate, felt the familiar pull of the abyss calling to him from beneath the floorboards. Above, the sky was a bruised purple, devoid of stars, as if the heavens themselves had squeezed their eyes shut to avoid witnessing the abomination that was about to unfold. The emir dismissed his attendants with a sharp wave of his hand, their shadows retreating from the solar like frightened cur dogs, leaving him alone with the oppressive silence and the secret that pulsed beneath his feet. He had recently interred a new guest in the basalt chamber, a scholar of fiqh from Alexandria whose only crime had been carrying a purse too heavy with gold dinars intended for the restoration of a mosque. The irony of stealing from God to feed his own godless vanity was a spice that Qasim savored on his tongue, a blasphemy so potent it made his head spin with a drunkard's delight. He approached the concealed entrance to the observation corridor, a narrow slip of a door hidden behind a heavy tapestry of woven wool depicting the hunting of a lion. With hands that trembled slightly from anticipation, he manipulated the hidden catch, a mechanism of oiled brass and iron that he had designed himself, marveling as he always did at the silent, predatory smoothness with which the wall swung inward. He stepped into the crawlspace, the air instantly shifting from the perfumed warmth of the palace to the dank, subterranean chill of the grave. The corridor was a tight fit, a stone intestine that wound its way down alongside the main shaft, barely wide enough for a man of his girth to shuffle through sideways. This was his sanctuary, his private theater of cruelty, where he was the sole audience member to the tragedy of another man's undoing. He moved deeper into the dark, the heavy iron door clicking shut behind him with a finality he failed to register, his mind focused entirely on the viewing grate ahead. As he pressed his face to the cold iron bars of the slit, he could hear the scholar below, not screaming, but reciting the Quran in a low, unwavering voice. The sound irritated Qasim. He preferred the music of panic, the weeping and the bargaining, not this steadfast anchor of faith in the face of oblivion. It was here, in this cramped artery of stone, that the emir's hubris reached its zenith. He whispered into the stale air, mocking the prayer rising from the pit, telling the darkness that he was the only power that mattered in this cubic fathom of earth. He imagined himself greater than the angels, for he held the keys to life and death in this domain, and the God of the scholar was nowhere to be found. But there is a name that shatters the comfort of shadows, a name that penetrates the deepest bedrock and the hardest heart, Al-Sabur, the all-seeing, the one whose vision is not limited by photons or horizons, the one who perceives the black ant on a black rock in a black night. Just as the emir pursed his lips to spit a final curse at the praying man, the world tilted. It was not the catastrophic, city-leveling quake that topples minarets and cracks the domes of mosques, but a singular, focused tremor, a geological shudder that seemed to originate from the very core of the planet, aimed with the precision of a divine arrow at this specific coordinate of longitude and latitude. The sensation was terrifyingly disorienting. The stone floor beneath Qasim's sandals lurched upward, throwing him violently against the rough masonry of the wall. The sound was not a roar, but a deep, grinding groan, the sound of the earth's teeth gnashing together. For a fleeting second, the emir thought the entire palace was collapsing upon him, and a bolt of primal fear, cold and sharp, pierced the armor of his arrogance. But the tremor passed as quickly as it had arrived, lasting no more than the time it takes to draw a single breath. The silence that followed was absolute, ringing in his ears like a struck bell. He scrambled to regain his footing, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his instinct screaming at him to flee, to return to the light, to abandon this game. He turned back toward the entrance, his hands fumbling in the pitch blackness of the corridor, reaching for the lever that would release the hidden door. His fingers found the cold metal of the latch, but when he pulled, the lever did not move. He pulled again, harder, putting his shoulder into the motion, but the mechanism was dead, frozen in place. The tremor, slight as it was, had shifted the limestone foundations of the palace by a mere fraction of an inch, but that fraction was enough. The heavy lintel stone above the door had slipped, dropping down and crushing the delicate brass gears of the lock, jamming the iron door into its frame with the weight of the entire palace pressing down upon it. Qasim was not merely locked in, he was sealed into the earth, entombed in a stone coffin of his own making. Panic, cold and liquid, began to rise in his gorge. He threw his weight against the door, grunting with exertion, his silk robes tearing against the rough walls. He kicked, he clawed, he battered the iron with his fists until his knuckles split and warm blood made the handle slick, but the door was as immovable as a mountain. He was trapped in a space 3 feet wide and 10 feet long, a crawlspace designed for a voyeur, now transformed into a cage for a beast. He turned back to the viewing grate, the only other aperture in his stone prison, hoping to call out, to scream for his guards, to demand that the scholar below pile up the rotting debris of previous victims to reach the slit. But as he scrambled back to the grate, a second realization, far more horrifying than the first, washed over him. The tremor had not only jammed the door, it had dislodged the ventilation shutter, a heavy plate of lead-lined iron designed to dampen sound. The shutter of the earth had caused the counterweight to snap, and the shutter had slammed down over the viewing slit, sealing it tight. The faint sliver of air and sound that had connected him to the dungeon, and by proxy, to the world of the living, was gone. The darkness was suddenly total, a physical substance that pressed against his eyes, his mouth, his nose. For the first time in his life, Amir Qasim knew what it was to be truly unseen. He stood frozen in the suffocating blackness, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps that sounded deafeningly loud in the confined space. The irony of his position began to dawn on him with the slow, crushing weight of a nightmare. He had spent years building a place where the light of God could not enter, believing it would hide his sins. And now, his wish had been granted in the most literal and terrifying manner possible. He was hidden. He was perfectly, completely, and irrevocably hidden. No human eye could see him. No guard knew he was there, for he had forbidden anyone from approaching the solar during his meditations. He had constructed a void to negate the existence of Al-Basir, and in response, the all-seeing had simply closed the lid on him, leaving him alone with the very darkness he had worshipped. The air in the corridor was finite, a limited resource that he was already consuming with his panicked hyperventilation. The smell of the earth, once so exciting to him, now smelled of damp decay and finality. He pounded on the walls, screaming until his throat felt like it was filled with broken glass, but he knew, with a certainty that turned his blood to ice, that the walls were too thick. He had designed them that way. He had insisted on the double-layered basalt, the sand-filled gaps to deaden the noise, the architectural silence. He was screaming into a vacuum of his own creation. He sank to his knees, the rough stone biting into his flesh, and the darkness seemed to lean in, whispering to him. It was not empty. That was the most terrifying revelation of all. The darkness was not the absence of things, it was a presence, a heavy, watching presence that filled the crawlspace, sitting on his chest, pressing against his eyelids. He realized then that he was not alone in the dark. He never had been. The eye he had mocked was there, in the pitch black, staring at him with a gaze that burned without light, stripping away his titles, his wealth, and his arrogance, leaving only the trembling, naked soul of a sinner trapped in the throat of the earth. The silence was no longer his accomplice, it was his judge, his jury, and his executioner. Time, which had once been a commodity measured in the rhythmic dripping of water clocks and the majestic sweep of the sun across the Cairene sky, ceased to exist as a linear concept and dissolved into a suffocating, amorphous ocean of black eternity. For Amir Qasim, trapped within the stone intestine of his own palace, the first hour of his entombment felt like a century, a frantic, animalistic explosion of denial that saw him flinging his corpulent body against the unyielding iron door until his shoulders were bruised to the color of ripe plums and his breath came in ragged, wet gasps. He screamed until his vocal cords were stripped raw, shrieking commands at guards who could not hear him, offering bribes to the empty air, and finally, begging with the pathetic mewling of a child left in the dark. But the architecture of his cruelty was flawless, the basalt walls, lined with wool and sand to keep the screams of his victims from disturbing his digestion, now swallowed his own cries with indifferent efficiency. He was screaming into a void that he had purchased with stolen gold, and the silence that returned his calls was heavy, mocking, and absolute. As the adrenaline of the initial panic began to sour into the cold, toxic sludge of dread, the physical reality of his prison began to assert itself with agonizing clarity. The crawlspace was a tomb, a narrow sarcophagus of masonry that did not allow him to stand or fully extend his limbs, forcing him into a crouched, fetal posture that sent cramping spasms of fire through his legs and back. The air was stagnant, a finite resource that tasted of old dust and the copper tang of his own bleeding knuckles, growing warmer and heavier with every frantic exhalation. As the first imaginary night descended, for in this pit, day and night were indistinguishable, the deprivation of the senses began to erode the foundations of his mind. The human brain, starved of visual input, begins to cannibalize itself, manufacturing phantoms to fill the void, and Causon, a man whose memories were a charnel house of atrocities, had ample material for his madness. At first, it was merely flashes of light, sparks of non-existent color exploding behind his eyelids like fireworks, the prisoner's cinema, that mocks the blind. But soon, the darkness began to take shapes. He saw, or thought he saw, the shimmering outline of the silk merchant Ibrahim standing at the far end of the crawlspace, holding a goblet of poisoned wine, his face twisted into a rictus of sorrow. He saw the Alexandrian scholar, not praying in the pit below, but sitting cross-legged on the emir's own chest, the weight of the vision pressing the air from his lungs. Causon squeezed his eyes shut, but the visions were not external, they were etched onto the back of his retina, scorched there by the fires of his guilt. He clawed at his face, leaving streaks of blood on his cheeks, trying to tear the sight from his eyes, but the faces remained, silent witnesses to his slow disintegration. The silence, too, began to teem with impossible noises. He heard the slithering of vipers in the corners of the cell, the rustle of dry parchment, and the distinct, wet sound of a throat being slit, played on an endless, looping rhythm. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sounds were vibrating through his very skull, a symphony of the damned conducted by his own fraying synapses. Thirst, the great leveler of kings and beggars, arrived on the second cycle of his waking nightmare, a physical agony that eclipsed the terror of the dark. His tongue swelled in his mouth like a dry sponge, filling the cavity until he gagged on his own flesh. The saliva turned to a thick, glue-like paste that made swallowing a torture. In his delirium, his mind conjured the memory of the fountains in his courtyard, the cool, clear water cascading over blue tiles, the condensation on a silver pitcher of sherbet. He could hear the water, smell the wet stone, but when he licked his cracked lips, he tasted only the salt of his sweat and the grit of the limestone dust. He began to hallucinate that the walls were weeping, that moisture was beating on the cold stone, and he dragged his tongue across the rough masonry, licking the filthy blocks in a debased display of desperation, only to find them dry as a bone. The man who had washed his hands a dozen times a day, who had flown into a rage at the sight of a speck of dirt, was now wallowing in his own filth. The crawlspace had no latrine, and the unavoidable biological reality of his confinement stripped away the last vestiges of his dignity. The stench of urine and fear filled the small box, a miasma of degradation that clung to his silk robes that were now tattered rags, stained and reeking. He was no longer the Emir Causon, the lion of Cairo, he was merely a piece of rotting meat in a stone jar, decomposing while still alive. It was in this state of abject brokenness, sometime during what might have been the third day, that the true horror of his theological error crashed down upon him with the weight of a collapsing mountain. He had spent his life believing that darkness was a shield, a veil that hid the sinner from the sight of the divine. He had treated the dark as an accomplice, a place where the laws of God were suspended. But as he lay curled in the fetal position, shivering in the heat, blind and broken, he realized with a clarity that pierced his madness that he had been fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. The darkness was not empty. It was full. It was a medium of transmission, a lens through which the attribute of Al-Basir, the all-seeing, was focused with terrifying intensity. He felt a gaze upon him, not from the corners of the room, but from the very air that pressed against his skin, from the marrow of his bones. He was being watched. Every gasp, every thought, every heartbeat was being observed by a presence that required no light to see. The darkness he had built to hide within was, in fact, the pupil of God's eye, and he was the speck of dust trapped beneath the lid. The privacy he had cherished was a lie. He had never been alone, not for a single moment of his wretched life. The murders, the thefts, the whispers, they had all been performed on a brightly lit stage before an audience of one. The psychological crushing was total. He tried to pray, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. How could he call upon the name he had mocked? How could he ask for mercy from the very sight he had tried to blind? He remembered the verse he had heard the scholar recite, the words he had laughed at. Does he not know that Allah sees? The question hung in the darkness, blazing in letters of fire. He knew now. Oh, he knew. He tried to bargain, whispering to the stone that he would build 100 mosques, that he would free 1,000 slaves, that he would walk barefoot to Mecca if only the door would open. But the door remained shut, a verdict in iron. His mind, unable to reconcile the magnitude of his fall, fractured completely. He began to giggle, a high, thin sound that bubbled up from his chest, sounding like the cry of a hyena. He laughed at the absurdity of it all, the gold he had buried that was now useless, the power he had wielded that could not move a single latch, the vanity that had led him to build his own oubliette. He laughed until he choked, until the laughter turned to dry, heaving sobs that racked his emaciated frame. As the end approached, the hallucinations shifted from the visual to the tactile. He felt hands touching him, cold, clammy hands grabbing at his ankles, his wrists, his throat. They were the hands of the men he had dropped into the pit, reaching up through the solid stone to claim their due. He thrashed in the dark, kicking at the air, fighting a war against ghosts who had all the time in the world. He felt the weight of the earth pressing down on him, miles of rock and soil crushing the air from his lungs, burying him alive. He was a pharaoh in a pyramid with no exit, a king of nothing, ruling over a kingdom of dust and silence. The arrogance that had sustained him was gone, replaced by a primal, infantile terror of the dark. He curled tighter into himself, trying to become small, trying to disappear, but he knew it was impossible. He was seen. He was known. And he was completely, utterly lost. The darkness pulsed with the rhythm of his own failing heart, a countdown to a silence that would never end, and as his consciousness began to drift on the tide of dehydration and madness, the last thing he sensed was not the absence of light, but the overwhelming, terrifying presence of an eye that never blinks, watching him dissolve into the history he had tried to write in blood. The disappearance of Amir Qasim did not result in the immediate chaos one might expect from the vanishing of such a titan of state, but rather birthed a period of suffocating, suspended animation that hung over the palace like the heavy, humid mist rising from the Nile at dawn. For the first few days following the night of the tremor, the household operated on the inertia of fear, the servants moving through the gilded corridors with the hushed reverence of those walking through a graveyard, terrifyingly uncertain of whether their master was merely absent or watching from some unseen vantage point. The emir was a man of capricious and sudden movements, prone to vanishing on secret business or retreating into periods of dark seclusion, and so the initial silence from the solar was interpreted not as a tragedy, but as a test. The captain of the guard, a Mamluk of Circassian blood whose loyalty was bought with silver and held with terror, posted sentries at the doors of the private quarters, under strict orders to allow no living soul to pass until the emir summoned them. But the summons never came. The sun rose and set over the minarets of Cairo, the muezzins called the faithful to prayer 5 times a day, and the great machinery of the city ground on, indifferent to the void that had opened in the heart of the palace. As the first week bled into the second, the silence transformed from a directive into a heavy, tangible presence, a phantom that stalked the halls. The whispers began in the scullery and the stables, low and superstitious, suggesting that the emir had been spirited away by the jinn he was rumored to consort with, or that the sultan, growing weary of Qasim's swelling ambition, had sent the black-robed assassins to silence him in the night. Yet, there was no blood, no sign of struggle, and the doors to the solar remained locked from the inside, a puzzle that defied the logic of steel and stone. The political vacuum created by his absence was initially filled with a frantic, paralyzed indecision, but as the days turned to weeks, the natural order of Mamluk ambition began to assert itself. His rivals in the citadel, sensing weakness like sharks smelling blood in the water, began to circle, sending spies to inquire after the emir's health, their polite inquiries masking the daggers in their smiles. Inside the palace, the discipline began to rot. Without the terrifying glare of Qasim to hold the household in check, the servants grew lax, the guards began to gamble in the courtyards, and the meticulous cleanliness that the emir had obsessed over began to fray. Dust settled on the marble tabletops, spiderwebs spun unchecked in the corners of the high ceilings, and the silver tarnished in the humid air. It was as if the palace itself was mourning, or perhaps decomposing, its soul linked inextricably to the man who was slowly withering within its walls. But the true horror was not in the political intrigue or the accumulation of dust, it was in the air itself. It began faintly, a subtle, sickly sweet note that threaded its way through the heavy aroma of frankincense and rosewater that was perpetually burned in the hallways. At first it was dismissed as the smell of a dead rat trapped behind the wainscoting, a common enough occurrence in a city as ancient and teeming as Cairo. The servants burned more incense, swinging the censers with frantic energy, trying to mask the offending odor with clouds of fragrant smoke. But the smell was not a transient thing, it was a rising tide, persistent and aggressive. By the third week, it had evolved from a nuisance into a miasma, a cloying, heavy stench of organic decay that stuck to the back of the throat and made the eyes water. It was the unmistakable, primal scent of death, but magnified and concentrated, as if the very stones of the palace were sweating corruption. It seeped into the fibers of the silk tapestries, it soured the wine in the goblets, and it turned the lavish banquets into nauseating ordeals where guests would gag into their napkins while trying to maintain the veneer of civility. The source was undeniable, it radiated from the private solar, the locked sanctuary where the emir had last been seen. The guards, hardened men who had seen battlefields strewn with corpses, found themselves unable to stand their posts near the door, driven back by the invisible wave of putrefaction that rolled out from the cracks in the masonry. It became impossible to ignore, impossible to rationalize. The ghost of Qasim was not a spirit, but a smell, a physical manifestation of the rot that had always been at the core of his opulent life. Finally, after 23 days of absence, the Sultan's own vizier arrived, his nose covered by a perfumed handkerchief, demanding that the doors be breached. The authority of the state finally overrode the fear of the master, and the order was given to break the seal. The palace smiths were brought in with heavy iron sledges and crowbars, their faces wrapped in layers of linen soaked in vinegar to ward off the fumes. The great cedar doors to the solar were smashed open, splintering under the blows, revealing a room that was perfectly, hauntingly empty. The untouched supper from weeks ago sat on the table, the meat reduced to a fuzzy mound of mold, the wine evaporated into a sticky red residue. But the smell was not coming from the room itself, it was seeping from the walls. The dogs brought in by the huntsman went mad, baying and scratching frantically at the heavy tapestry that depicted the lion hunt, the very spot where the secret door was concealed. With a growing sense of dread, the captain ordered the tapestry torn down, revealing the smooth, unbroken surface of the limestone wall. To the untrained eye, it was solid, but the master mason, tapping the stone with the handle of his hammer, heard the hollow, resonant thud that betrayed the void behind. The order was given to excavate. The first blow of the pickaxe against the plaster sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Dust, white and choking, billowed into the air, mixing with the stench to create a fog of death. Stone by stone, the masons dismantled the false wall, their coughing and the ring of metal on rock the only sounds in a palace that held its breath. As the breach widened, the smell billowed out in a concentrated wave that sent the vizier and the guards reeling back, retching uncontrollably. It was a physical blow, a dense, hot blast of air from a tomb. Torches were brought forward, their flickering light cutting through the gloom of the newly opened cavity. The soldiers peered into the narrow, dark throat of the crawlspace, their hands gripping the hilts of their scimitars, expecting a monster. And in a sense, they found one. At the far end of the narrow corridor, huddled in the corner where the mechanism of the trapdoor had jammed, lay the remains of Emir Qasim. He was not the imperious, silk-draped lord they remembered. The heat of the crawlspace, combined with the lack of ventilation, had accelerated the grisly process of decomposition, yet the dry, stagnant air had also preserved him in a grotesque, semi-mummified state. He was curled into a tight ball, his knees drawn up to his chest in the universal posture of the unborn and the terrified. His robes, once the finest damask that gold could buy, were shredded into ribbons, hanging off his emaciated frame like the wrappings of a leper. The walls around him told the story of his final hours. They were gouged and scratched, marked with long, desperate furrows where he had torn his fingernails out trying to dig through the solid basalt. The floor was scattered with the glitter of gold coins and precious gems, the ransom he had carried into the dark, now lying useless in the dust, ignored by the rats and the worms. But it was the face of the emir that seared itself into the nightmares of every man present. His head was thrown back, the skin drawn tight over the skull like parchment, his mouth locked open in a silent, eternal scream that exposed teeth broken from gnashing against the iron door. And his eyes were the center of the horror. They were wide open, bulging from their sockets, clouded with the milky film of death but fixed with a terrifying intensity on a point in the darkness just above him. It was not the blank stare of a corpse, it was a look of absolute, active recognition. It was the face of a man who, in the final moment of his existence, had seen something so overwhelming, so undeniable, that the terror had frozen his features into a permanent monument to judgment. He did not look like a man who had died of thirst or asphyxiation, he looked like a man who had been frightened to death. The guards recoiled, muttering prayers to ward off evil, crossing themselves and averting their gaze from the hideous spectacle. They saw the irony, stark and brutal, laid out before them. The man who had built a chamber of darkness to hide his sins from the world had been consumed by that very darkness. The man who had stripped his victims of their dignity and lowered them into a pit had died naked and clawing at the walls of his own trap. The discovery sent a shockwave through the city of Cairo that resonated far more deeply than the earthquake that had sealed his fate. The story of Qasim traveled from the palace to the mosques, from the barracks to the bazaars, carried on the lips of storytellers who embellished the horror with every retelling. They spoke of the gold that could not buy air, of the walls that could not block the gaze of the angels, of the silence that screamed. The vast fortune of the emir was seized by the sultan, his lands were redistributed, and his name was chiseled off the monuments he had built. But the palace itself remained abandoned, a cursed place that no merchant would buy and no noble would inhabit. It stood for decades as a hollow shell, a home for bats and scorpions, shunned by the locals who claimed that on moonless nights, you could still hear the sound of scratching coming from beneath the floorboards. The viewing chamber was sealed up again, this time with bricks and mortar blessed by the imams, closing the eye of the pit forever. Yet, the lesson of Emir Qasim remained, etched into the collective memory of the city like a surah carved in stone. It served as a grim reminder to the tyrants and the thieves, to the men who believed that power was a shield against consequence and that walls could create a sovereign state where morality did not apply. The corpse in the wall became a parable of the divine attribute of Al-Sabur, a testament to the inescapable reality that there are no secrets in the architecture of creation. Qasim had believed that if he could not see the observer did not exist. He had played a game of peek-a-boo with the Almighty, covering his own eyes and believing the world had vanished. In the end, he was left with the ultimate, crushing truth that rings through the ages, from the dungeons of Mamluk Cairo to the modern world. You can hide from the laws of men, you can hide from the light of the sun, and you can hide from the judgment of history, but you can never, ever hide from the eyes of the one who sees the black ant on the black rock in the black night, and whose vision penetrates the deepest stone to find the trembling heart of the sinner within. The darkness is not a curtain, it is clear glass to the all-seeing.